The door clicked open and I froze in place, barely daring to breathe. She stepped into the room, her movements slow and deliberate, the dim glow of the hallway casting her shadow long against the walls. She hadn't seen me yet, not fully, but I knew the second she did, everything would change. Her hand paused on the light switch. "Is someone in here?" she asked, her voice laced with suspicion, low but firm. I shifted under the sheets, my pulse hammering in my ears. "It's me," I said, my voice steady despite the storm inside me. She turned sharply, her eyes narrowing as they locked onto mine. The faint light from the hallway caught the shock on her face as she took in the scene. Me lying there, bare-chested under the thin sheets of her bed, the faint scent of her perfume lingering on the pillow beside me. "What the hell are you doing in here?" she demanded, her voice rising just enough to send a chill up my spine. "I needed to see you," I said simply, keeping my gaze steady, even as her eyes darted to the door behind her. "This is insane," she hissed, stepping closer but keeping her distance. Her arms crossed tightly over her chest, a futile shield against the weight of the moment. "Do you have any idea how inappropriate this is?" "Of course I do," I said. "But you can't tell me you don't feel it too. This tension between us." She inhaled sharply, the color rising in her cheeks as she glared at me. "You've crossed a line. A big one." I sat up slightly, letting the sheet slip just enough to keep her attention locked on me. "Maybe. But I don't regret it." She opened her mouth to retort, but no words came out. Instead, she stared at me, her expression a mix of disbelief, anger, and something else, something she was trying desperately to suppress. "Do you know what you're doing?" she finally whispered, her voice shaky. "Yes," I replied, my tone unwavering. "And so do you." Her breath hitched, and for a moment, the room seemed to shrink around us, the silence thick and suffocating. The distance between us felt both infinite and non-existent, as if the air itself was charged with the tension we'd both been pretending wasn't there. "This isn't right," she said, more to herself than to me. "Then why haven't you walked away?" I challenged, my eyes never leaving hers. She took a step back, her hand brushing against the edge of the doorframe as if it could anchor her. But she didn't leave. She just stood there, her chest rising and falling with every shallow breath, her eyes flickering between me and the door. For a moment, neither of us moved, the weight of unspoken words hanging heavy in the air. And then slowly, almost imperceptibly, she stepped closer. She stood just a few steps away from me, her arms still crossed tightly against her chest, as though she could barricade herself from whatever was about to unfold. Her gaze flicked to the floor, then back to me, the storm in her eyes unmistakable. She was angry, confused, but there was something else there too. "What are you trying to do?" she asked, her voice softer now, almost pleading. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I swung my legs over the edge of the bed, the sheets pooling around my waist as I leaned forward, my elbows resting on my knees. The air between us was thick, the silence electric. "I'm not trying to hurt you," I said finally, "but I can't keep pretending. I can't act like this isn't happening." Her head snapped up, her eyes narrowing. "And what exactly is this?" she demanded. "You know what it is," I said quietly, my voice steady but low. "You felt it too. Don't tell me you haven't." She opened her mouth to argue, but the words seemed to catch in her throat. Her hands dropped to her sides, clenching into fists as she took another step closer. This is wrong," she said, her voice trembling. "You can't just..." "I can't just what?" I interrupted, standing now. I didn't move closer, but I was close enough that I could see the way her breath quickened, the way her shoulders rose and fell with every inhale. "Say what I feel. Tell the truth." She shook her head, taking a half step back. "You're crossing a line. You're pushing something that shouldn't even be possible." "But it is," I said firmly. "You know it is." Her gaze wavered, darting from my eyes to my chest and back again. "You don't understand what you're doing," she whispered, her voice cracking under the weight of her own emotions. "Then tell me," I said, softening my tone. "Tell me why you're still standing here. Why you haven't walked out that door." Her lips parted, but no words came out. Instead, she let out a shaky breath, her hands trembling at her sides. The distance between us felt like a fragile thread, stretched taut and ready to snap. Every inch she moved closer felt like a decision, a surrender to something we both knew was dangerous. "I don't want to hurt you," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "You won't," I replied, taking a single step forward. Her eyes searched mine looking for something. An answer, a reason, an escape. But there was no escape now. Whatever this was, it had pulled us both in, and there was no turning back. She lifted a hand as if to push me away, but instead, her fingers hovered just inches from my chest. I could feel the heat radiating from her skin, the hesitation in her touch. "You're making this impossible," she murmured, her voice thick with emotion. "No," I said gently, leaning closer, my voice low. "I'm making it real." The air between us seemed to vibrate with unspoken tension. Her hand finally made contact, pressing lightly against my chest as if testing the boundaries of what was happening. The touch was fleeting, tentative, but it sent a jolt through me that I couldn't ignore. "Don't," she said, though her hand didn't move away. "Don't what?" I asked, my voice steady. "Don't tell the truth? Don't feel this?" Her hand pressed harder against me, and she shook her head, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "This isn't supposed to happen," she said, almost to herself. "But it is," I said, taking her hand in mine. Her fingers trembled slightly, but she didn't pull away. "And we can't pretend it's not." She let out a shaky breath, her shoulders slumping as the fight seemed to drain out of her. "You don't know what you're asking for," she said, her voice barely audible. "Yes, I do," I said firmly. "And so do you." The room felt smaller now, the walls pressing in as the tension between us grew. I could hear the soft hitch in her breath, see the way her chest rose and fell as she tried to steady herself. Her eyes met mine, and for a moment everything else faded away. "I don't know how to do this," she admitted, her voice breaking. "Neither do I said. "But we'll figure it out." Her hand slipped from mine, but instead of stepping back, she moved closer. The space between us almost non-existent now. I could feel the warmth of her skin, the faint scent of her perfume lingering in the air. "This is a mistake," she said, though her voice lacked conviction. "Maybe," I said softly. "But it's our mistake to make." She hesitated, her gaze flickering to the door one last time before returning to mine. "This changes everything," she whispered. "I know," I said, my voice steady. "But I don't care." The moment stretched on, the silence heavy with anticipation. Every nerve in my body was on edge, waiting for her to make a choice, to step away or step closer. And then finally she made her decision. "I don't know who I am either," I admitted. "But I know how I feel. About you." Her breath hitched and she looked away, as if the weight of my words was too much to bear. "You don't mean that," she said, but there was no conviction in her voice. "Yes, I do," I said firmly. "I've never been more certain of anything in my life." She turned back to me, her eyes searching mine, looking for something, truth maybe, or a reason to believe me. Whatever she found, it made her inhale sharply, her resolve faltering. "This will ruin everything," she whispered. "Maybe," I said, stepping even closer, until there was barely any space between us. "But it might also be the only thing that makes sense." The tension between us snapped like a taut wire. One moment we were standing there, caught in the gravity of our words, and the next we were moving toward each other, the space between us vanishing. Her hands found my shoulders, her touch hesitant but firm, as if testing the boundaries of what was happening. My hands hovered at her waist, not quite touching, waiting for a signal. "This is insane," she said, her voice trembling. "Maybe," I replied, my voice low. "But it's real." Her breath came in shallow bursts, and her fingers tightened against my shoulders. "If we do this, there's no going back," she said, her tone both a warning and a plea. "I don't want to go back," I said simply. She closed her eyes as if bracing herself, and when she opened them again, there was a fire in her gaze that hadn't been there before. "Then don't stop," she whispered. The moment was a blur of movement and emotion. Her hand slid from my shoulders to my chest, her touch leaving a trail of warmth in its wake. My hands found her waist, pulling her closer until there was no space left between us. Every rational thought, every doubt, melted away as we collided, our actions fueled by the raw intensity that had been simmering between us for so long. Her lips brushed against mine, tentative at first, but the hesitation didn't last. The kiss deepened, and with it the floodgates opened. Every suppressed emotion, every unsaid word, poured out in that single moment. Time seemed to stand still as we pulled apart, both of us breathing heavily. Her hands lingered on my chest, her fingers curling slightly into the fabric of my shirt. "This changes everything," she said, her voice barely audible. "I know," I replied, my heart pounding. She stepped back, her arms wrapping around herself again. But this time it wasn't to shield herself. It was as if she were trying to hold on to the moment, to make sense of what had just happened. "What do we do now?" she asked, her voice trembling. I didn't have an answer. All I knew was that I didn't regret it, even if the weight of what we'd done was beginning to settle over us like a thick fog. The night stretched on, the air between us charged with unspoken emotions. We sat side by side on the porch steps, the silence between us no longer uncomfortable but heavy with the knowledge that nothing would ever be the same. "We can't keep this a secret forever," she said eventually, her voice breaking the quiet. "I know," I said. "But right now I just want to be here. With you." She turned to look at me, her eyes searching mine. "What if this is a mistake?" "Then it's our mistake to make," I said, my voice steady. Her lips curved into a faint, bittersweet smile, and she reached for my hand, her fingers intertwining with mine. For a moment the world felt right, even if we both knew it couldn't last. The sound of a car in the distance broke the spell, and we both tensed, the reality of our situation crashing down around us. "This is going to get complicated," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Life always is," I replied. We sat there, hand in hand as the night deepened, the stars above us offering no answers, only the promise of more questions to come. Her hands moved to my shoulders, her touch hesitant at first but growing firmer as she closed the gap between us. Her breath was warm against my skin, her voice trembling as she whispered, "We can't take this back." "I don't want to," I said, my voice low but resolute. Her lips parted as if to protest, but instead she leaned in, her forehead resting against mine. The tension between us finally broke, giving way to something deeper, something undeniable. As her arms slipped around me, I knew there was no turning back. The room had grown still, the air heavy with unsaid words and emotions neither of us seemed ready to confront. I stood near the window, my back turned to her, watching the dim light of the street lamp filter through the blinds. Behind me, she was seated on the couch, her fingers nervously twisting a loose thread on the sleeve of her sweater. The silence was unbearable, a quiet storm raging between us. "I can't do this anymore," she said finally, her voice breaking the stillness. I turned to face her, my chest tightening. "Do what?" "This. Pretending like everything is fine when it's not," she said, her voice trembling. She looked up at me, her eyes glossy with unshed tears. "You act like you're okay but you're not. I can feel it. I see it every time you look at me." Her words hit me harder than I expected. I wanted to deny it, to tell her she was wrong, but the truth lodged itself in my throat, refusing to come out. "You're imagining things," I said, my voice low. But even I didn't believe the words as they left my mouth. "Don't do that," she snapped, standing abruptly. Her hands clenched into fists at her sides as she took a step closer. "Don't act like I don't know you. I do. Better than anyone else." The room felt smaller now, her presence overwhelming as she stood just a few feet away. Her frustration was palpable, crackling in the air like static electricity. "Then what do you want me to say?" I asked, my voice rising despite my attempt to stay calm. "That you're right? That I'm not okay? Fine. You're right. But what difference does it make?" Her eyes widened, the raw vulnerability in my tone catching her off guard. For a moment she was silent, her lips parting as if to respond, but no words came. "It makes a difference because I care about you," she said finally, her voice quieter now. "And I can't just stand by and watch you fall apart." I let out a bitter laugh, shaking my head. "Care about me? You're part of the reason I feel like this in the first place." Her breath caught, and she took a step back as though I had physically struck her. "What are you talking about?" "You know exactly what I'm talking about," I said, stepping forward, my emotions boiling over. "The way you look at me. The way you act like everything between us is normal when it's anything but." She shook her head, her expression a mix of confusion and denial. "That's not fair. Isn't it?" I countered, my voice firm. "Tell me you don't feel it. Tell me I'm imagining things." Her silence was answer enough. The breaking point came suddenly, like a dam giving way. She moved closer, her breathing shallow, her hands trembling at her sides. "You think I don't feel it?" she said, her voice low and unsteady. "Of course I do. I've tried to ignore it, to push it away, but it's always there." Her words sent a shiver down my spine, equal parts relief and dread. This was what I had wanted, what I had feared. So what now? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She looked at me, her eyes filled with a mix of emotions I couldn't decipher. I don't know, she admitted. I just know I can't keep pretending it's not there. Her hand lifted as if on instinct, brushing against my arm. The touch was light, almost imperceptible, but it sent a jolt through me. My breath hitched and I stepped closer, the space between us shrinking to nothing. The moment felt suspended in time, the world outside fading into irrelevance. Her hand lingered on my arm, her fingers curling slightly against my skin. I could see the rise and fall of her chest, the unsteady rhythm of her breathing. "This is dangerous," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I know," I said, my gaze locked on hers. "But it doesn't change how I feel." She let out a shaky breath, her eyes flickering to the floor before meeting mine again. "I don't know if I can do this," she said, her voice trembling. "You don't have to decide right now," I said softly. "But I needed you to know." Her hand slipped away, and for a moment I thought she would walk away, that this moment would end in silence and regret. But then she stepped closer, her resolve wavering but still present. The world seemed to hold its breath as she reached up, her fingers brushing against my face. The touch was tentative, as if she were afraid I might disappear. "This changes everything," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know," I replied, my own voice unsteady. "But it's already changed, hasn't it?" She nodded slowly, her hand dropping to her side as she took a step back. The tension in the room was almost unbearable, the weight of what had just happened pressing down on both of us. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I don't know," I admitted. "But we'll figure it out. Together." The aftermath hit us both like a tidal wave. She turned away, wrapping her arms around herself as if to shield herself from the reality of what had just happened. I stood there, my heart pounding in my chest, unsure of what to do or say. "I need some air," she said suddenly, her voice shaky. Without waiting for a response, she walked toward the door, leaving me alone in the room. I sank onto the couch, my head in my hands as I tried to make sense of the moment. The weight of my actions settled over me, a mix of relief and guilt twisting in my gut. Through the open window, I could hear the faint sounds of the world outside. A car passing, the distant hum of voices. But inside, the silence was deafening. I didn't know what the future held or how we would navigate the fallout of what had just happened. All I knew was that nothing would ever be the same. The sound of the door closing echoed in my ears as she walked out. I stayed frozen on the couch, replaying everything that had just happened. My chest felt heavy, my breath shallow as if I were caught in a whirlwind that I couldn't escape. Minutes passed, maybe longer. The silence of the room grew louder, pressing down on me, until the weight became unbearable. I stood up abruptly and followed her. She was on the porch, leaning against the railing, her arms wrapped tightly around herself as if trying to hold herself together. The cool night air made her hair flutter, but she didn't seem to notice. "Why did you leave?" I asked, stepping out into the night, my voice quieter than I intended. She didn't turn around. "I needed space," she said simply. I stepped closer, the sound of my footsteps loud against the wooden boards. "Space from me?" She hesitated, then shook her head. "No. From myself." That answer stopped me in my tracks. "What does that mean?" She finally turned to face me, her eyes red-rimmed but defiant. "It means I don't know who I am right now. I don't know what I'm supposed to do with all of this." She gestured between us, her voice cracking. "With you." I didn't know how to respond. Every word I prepared in my head felt inadequate, hollow. So instead of speaking, I moved closer, close enough that I could see the faint quiver of her bottom lip, the tension in her shoulders.